Hello, everybody. Welcome again to another episode of Disability Landscape. I'm Charlie Brose. With me today is my co-host, Tricia Carlberg, and she's going to introduce a journalist from the Twin Cities, I presume. Is that correct? And
Yes,
we'll go from there.
yes, Charlie. Today I'm interviewing from my car, as you can see, so I'm pretty excited. But today we have David M. Perry, a freelance journalist covering politics, history, education, and disability rights. He's also a history professor at the U of M, and he's written for several publications, including the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Guardian, amongst others. So we're really excited to meet you, David.
It's nice to be here. And I'm not technically a professor, I'm an advisor. I used to be a professor somewhere else, just in
Oh,
case my
okay.
colleagues are watching so that they don't think I'm claiming something I don't have status to do, but I am a
Former history
historian. Yeah,
professor.
that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Nice to
Uh,
meet you all.
yeah. So, David, what inspires you to write about disability rights?
Sure. So it really started, as I think is true for many people in my situation, by becoming a parent of a disabled child. And that led to a long process that now I also understand my own, thinking of understanding my own lifelong struggles with depression and anxiety as disability and my dyslexia as disability. And I'm happy to talk. I've
Absolutely.
been very open about my own experiences, but I came to it as a parent that 14 years ago, my son was born. A few minutes later, diagnosed with Down syndrome. And I realized at that moment that I didn't know anything. I had just received a PhD. I was allegedly extremely well educated and knowledgeable, and I just didn't know anything. And the things that I did know about Down syndrome were mostly wrong. They were things that are not true, or that were 50 years out of date. I just didn't know anything. So I did what I think maybe anyone would do, but certainly for me as a historian, what I did is I started reading. Um, and I found a lot to learn, a lot to read, mostly from disabled people who had led the way in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s through the ADA and continue to lead in some cases, or the
Hmm.
new people have emerged, other journalists, other parents. There was just a lot to read. And I quickly realized there was a big disconnect between what kind of the community was saying and what people generally understood, that there was a lot of ignorance like mine. And that maybe through effective journalism, there would be a way to bridge that gap. So that's really where it came from.
Yeah, it's a struggle enough raising children. Unfortunately, they don't come with a manual, so
They
I can't
don't.
imagine.
Very disappointing. They should have a manual.
They should. But it's really exciting the work that you're doing. Uh, and one of the articles that you discuss just talks a little bit about HR, and when you're going in to apply for a job, it, your article discusses how HR might say something like there's physical requirements to this job.
Sure.
And can you talk to us a little bit about that and how it applies to disabled individuals?
Sure. So this is something I really started working on in higher education because that was my work environment, but it's really very broad. There are jobs in which one has to do certain kinds of physical tasks, right? If you're a roofer, you need to be able to get up on a roof. It's reasonable to ask to say, I'm only going to hire you if you can climb a ladder. Now, I actually know people who can't climb ladders who can get up on roofs, but the ADA is saying has the standard of reasonableness. So it is reasonable to ask a roofer to climb a ladder, but it's not reasonable to ask an English professor to climb a ladder.
Right.
It's not reasonable to ask a Spanish professor to that they'll only be considered for the job if they can lift 25 pounds. It's not reasonable to ask a teacher to be able to necessarily speak verbally. It's certainly not reasonable to ask them to be able to see with their eyes or hear with their ears, or as I've seen in some job ads, taste, right? Like you don't need
Yeah.
to be able to taste to be a Spanish professor. But what's happened is really as part of covering themselves against workers' compensation claims.
Okay.
Human resource departments. Again, I started at universities, but you can find it in the tech industry, nonprofits, anywhere you look. Started adding in all these clauses saying, "Hey, these are tasks you might have to do on the job, and so if you get hurt doing one of these tasks, we don't have to cover you in the same way. You're still eligible for workers' compensation, but we're legally protected. You can't sue us. And so they've added in all these standards. When I covered this in higher ed, I talked to a commissioner at the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and they said, nope, it's illegal. You can't do that. You can only list requirements as essential if they're actually essential. If I'm a teacher, there's an essential requirement that I communicate. But notice how I said communicate and not speak, right?
Sure.
Not There's a lot of ways to communicate, and you can even say effectively communicate, but that doesn't mean you get to dictate the mechanism. There are jobs that say you must have a car, but that's illegal. They need unless it's a driving job, in which case that's different. But asking someone to have a driver's license may eliminate lots of disabled people who don't have driver's license or can't have driver's licenses. But the actual requirement is you've got to get to work on time, right? So it's one of the ways, and there are anyone who pays attention to disability knows that there are thousands, probably examples like this in different categories. But it's one of the ways in which there are these barriers that are erected. The barriers aren't actually necessary. They're not realistic barriers that are an actual problem, but they keep, in particular in this case, disabled people out of the workforce, either because then the job discriminates, but more commonly, or at least not more commonly, also importantly, people self-discriminate. You're a disabled person, you could do the work, but you cannot, in fact, lift 25 pounds. You see that in the job ad. And whereas I can lift 25 pounds, I would not even notice it. I would skim past it thinking, I'm going to be a history professor. That's ridiculous. I don't have to lift 25 pounds. But someone else who can't might see it and say, oh, well, I just shouldn't apply for it after all. So there's an illegal, it's illegal, but it leads people to self-segregate, to keep themselves out of the workforce. And as your listeners probably know, the disabled employment rates are terrible. And a lot of some of it has to do with discrimination that is overt, but some of it has to do with this kind of more subtle discrimination. But it's still discrimination, and it's still illegal.
Exactly. And, you talk about the self-segregation. If I'm looking at, the want ads online and I see, computer experience, that's me up and
Yeah.
down the line. But it also says, well, you have to, lift 25-pound boxes. Well, I'm unable to do that.
Yeah.
And so, but, how frequently is that 25-pound box going to come into play in that position?
Yeah.
I may never have to,
Yeah.
but because I see the requirement is there, I'm looking at myself going, well, sorry, I can't do this.
And
And
human resource departments have excuses. They say, oh, well, if you said you need an accommodation, they'll give you one because they
Right.
have to. But they put that clause in there, and unless if like there are librarian jobs, I'm thinking about higher education. Some librarians have to do shelving and some don't. And if you have to do shelving, it's reasonable to say you need to lift weight. And then if you got the job, you could say, I need an accommodation, and they could negotiate whether that's reasonable, right? Reasonable is a term of art. It's litigatable. But if it's
Exactly.
not actually essential to the job, they can't put it in as essential to the job. And so, but they do. The minute you go to, tech jobs, the tech world, and we're seeing this right now in COVID, right? The tech world has made so many jobs so much more accessible for so many people with different kinds of access needs, but only if human resource departments open the way.
Exactly. Exactly. Um, so you write about representation, politics, and inclusion. Um, and I understand that comes from your son with Down syndrome. How
Yep.
does that, you know, how does that affect your skew on the way you look at life and the things you write?
Yeah, it's really been transformative in so many ways. It is my point of access to understand. Again, in 2006, before my son was born, I would have said I understood a lot of these things, that I had studied that I'd studied history of difference, whether we're talking about gender or race or sexuality or religion. I was very interested in difference and exclusion and marginalization. It's something I'd taken classes in, but it does become different when it's your child, and
Right.
you encounter when you encounter systems that don't just accidentally exclude, but that are really designed to exclude, that are
Yeah.
designed to marginalize. And it changes your focus. And I just should say, my son was diagnosed with Down syndrome when he was born, but I'm also very proud to say that he was diagnosed as autistic. Um, well, I guess about 3 years ago, although we've known for about 5 years. And so, the autistic community, the self advocate community in particular, has been really important for me to understand the world my son is in, and then extrapolate more broadly from there to think about marginalization, to think about difference, to think about discrimination and the many ways it manifests. When you say someone is ableist, just like when you say someone is racist or sexist, often the excuse is, well, I didn't mean to be, or I don't have a racist bone in my body is what you hear about racism, but I hear about ableism too. I'm not ableist, but it makes you think not about what someone says they are, but what they do, right? What are the consequences of their actions on the world and on other people? And again,
Right.
these are things I've known in abstract, my whole kind of adult life, but it's very different when it's your child. There's a different kind of emotional response, and it's pushed me to do different kinds of work. I think I might well just still be a history professor and not really write, not do a lot of journalism, certainly not have quit my professor job to spend more time writing, to try to really commit to writing and trying to make a difference in the world,
Okay.
without my son.
So, you're kind of foisted into the world of disability when your son is born, and it really has opened your eyes to more things beyond what you were already focused on,
I think
correct?
that's true. Yeah, absolutely.
And so it really does give you, I mean, yes, Trin is Tricia's a little person. I'm a double amputee. We see world through the eyes of disability every day, and when you come into it, through the birth of a child, that really does change the way your worldview goes.
Absolutely. And it's changed the way of my, as I said, kind of at the beginning, my view of self. I, I started I started having symptoms of depression in fourth grade. So that's a
Uh-huh.
long time ago. I'm 48. Um, I really only figured out that it started in fourth grade like 2 years ago, because I was talking about fourth grade and I was talking about, yeah, I would fake being sick and then I'd make myself sick and I would think about hurting myself. And I'm like, oh, because I had talked about depression 3 or 4 years ago, and it's only like, oh, that's when it started, right? And
Yep.
it's been true the whole time, but having the language to understand my experiences, and hopefully it's not distressing to people to hear. I mean, I have depression, I have anxiety, and I've been dealing with ideation around self-harm my whole life. So those are things that are just true. But having the language to process it, having the ability to connect to other resources, to be able to say that sentence out loud without as just a statement of identity and fact, rather than as a, what's wrong with me, but also to seek
Mhm.
help, to say, hey, maybe I need support, maybe I need accommodations. And kind of on a lesser level, I mean, than self-harm, I'm also dyslexic. And when I was five, when I was five, right, I taught myself to read backwards. I read by taking kind of all the different words at the same time, letting them just flow into my head and then reassembling them as I go. And I
Okay.
didn't know, I mean, that's the only way I know how to describe it. I didn't know everyone didn't read that way. It's very fast. So people saw me as a precocious fast reader, but in fact, I'm dyslexic. Why is this good reader so bad at spelling? Because I'm dyslexic.
Yep.
And again, this is not, I got to say, the depression realizations have been life changing. The dyslexia realizations are, oh, that's kind of funny. But again, it's through the engaging the disability community that I've been able to understand myself better and understand, you know, the net consequences of being called lazy my whole life. When I'm thinking, I'm working pretty hard. Why? But in fact, my work is kind of lousy. Look how terrible my spelling is. I must just be lazy, right? I mean, it's better to have. It's better for me on a selfish, personal level to understand who I am,
Okay.
and then hopefully it's better for other people if I do public work in order to try to help them also bring that realization, or help them rethink how they teach, or use tech in the classroom, or just add captions to videos, or whatever it is, that they
Right.
rethink how they engage the world in a broader sense. So it's personal and structural, the work I'm trying to do.
Exactly. And you talk about two um kind of very real hidden disabilities.
Yeah.
Just depression can affect your work life and how you go about interacting with other people. The dyslexia is, definitely, a big challenge in your kind of work where, you're studying things
Yeah.
frequently and you want to get it right.
Yeah.
I will say I'm also a person with depression. It's probably long standing. I have no idea where it started for me, but I knew when it became unbearable, and that was that fateful day in September of 2001.
Sure.
And you realize at that point, I have a problem. Let's fix this. Let's do something about it. And it's been very good for me since then.
Yeah. One of the pieces I haven't written, although I've thought about it, I haven't quite got it yet, is real world events, you can be depressed and then you can also react to events. I haven't thought a lot about how lucky I am that I spent years working on my depression before this last year of COVID, because
Sure.
it provided me with tools to cope with stress and anxiety and fear, and panic that is totally rational, right? I have a lifetime of irrational panic.
Yep.
Um, I think being afraid during COVID is a very rational thing to be, but you still need cope. You still need to cope. And, it's the work I've done in depression that's provided me with, to whatever extent I've managed well, those have been the tools I've relied on.
Okay.
Yeah, to add something too, Charlie and I both, we do improv, and that's helped me tremendously this year to deal
Yeah.
with like anxiety and putting yourself out there. And I joke around because I drive rideshare, and I was joking around with a client, and I was like, well, even though it's a pandemic, I think I laughed more in the last year than I have in a long time, because um improv is available like on Zoom or different platforms, and this kind of makes it accessible for people with disabilities, because transition is often the hardest for
Mm,
people with disabilities, and transportation. And so yeah, I would definitely recommend that too for people who are struggling.
yeah.
Just try improv, put yourself out there, or just try to laugh about the situation too. I think that helps.
And one of my mantras, really, I've been saying it since late March a year ago, is when it became clear what was going to happen around sort of work in particular, was that anything we've made accessible due to the pandemic needs to stay accessible afterwards. So I'm talking
Yes.
about it, things like academic conferences or jobs, but improv too, right? Like improv needs to stay accessible in the
Yep.
future, even when people can get together, if they, in a theater again, even when the physical becomes part of it again, the accessibility, we just can't abandon our gains in accessibility.
Totally.
And
Go ahead, Charlie.
as we speak about the pandemic for the last year, um, how has it affected you know your son in educational
Yeah.
opportunities, things like that? Because you know, going to a home learning situation for someone with Down syndrome, I can see might be a bit traumatic or difficult to do.
Yeah. And again, I know children and parents for whom home learning has been wonderful.
Hmm.
So I have a long series of complaints. I'll keep it short, but I have a long series of complaints. But I like to start by saying what we have to do is think about individualized structure, and again, keep the good stuff. So there have been children um, for whom home learning has been great because it's taken them out of a classroom where an ableist classroom environment that forced them to structure their behavior in a certain kind of way that was difficult or impossible. And so that's been great. For my son, it's been a total disaster. And some of that disaster is understandable, and some of it is our choices from the school district. And I've written about this a couple of times now. When the pandemic started, essentially, we were all just locked down. my wife and I really had to choose between supporting him over Zoom, or having him not learn. And I ended up
Mm.
going half time for a while, but I have to say that between March and May of last year, he essentially had no education. And I don't particularly blame the school for that. We were all panicked. It was all new. We were all trying to make it up as we went. Everyone tried very hard. It just wasn't an effective way to communicate with him. But then come the following fall, when we've had time to plan, there was still no ability to provide him with support in the home. So we were forced to choose between no education functionally or sending him to school during a dangerous pandemic.
Mhm.
Um, and I think, I mean, unless you're really interested in government policy, I could talk about the ways in which departments of education, our local Department of Education, Department of Human Services, and then the DC system, so local, state, federal systems, all collectively failed to support my son, whereas in other states, state departments did figure it out. But the net result is we had no means of having in-home support for our son unless my wife or I quit our jobs or we hired out of
Right.
pocket, which we couldn't do. So we sent him to school when schools opened, and he got COVID and he brought it home. My wife got COVID, and they're both fine, but it was very scary. And then another month went by when the whole state shut down, when he had no support. And we kind of did everything we could do. We hired a lawyer, and I did journalism. We did advocacy. We took 100 meetings. We took many meetings. I got state lawmakers involved, and we just were never able to get the school district to provide the support that he is very clearly owed under federal disability education
Exactly.
law. So that's a problem. And he's now in school. He's in school right now as we talk. And assuming that this fourth wave of COVID doesn't get too bad, I suspect that will continue for the rest of his year. But it could get bad again. And there is still no plan for what happens if we have to go back to remote learning.
Yeah.
There is no plan to provide my son his federally mandated civil right of an education
Yeah.
under remote learning. And I've been advised by my attorney that right now is a bad time to fight it, in that school districts or departments of education are pretty lenient in terms of enforcement. But as we
Sure.
get past this, that is one of the big battles I hope to fight over the next couple of years. It's not going to help my son with his 8th grade. That's where he is now. But
Yeah.
I'm worried about where we are in 2 years, and I'm worried about, this is not going to be the last time in which we revert, I suspect, in his
Yeah.
life and our lives, that we revert to, whether because of weather or whatever or disease, we revert to a distance learning. And I just want to make sure that children with disabilities have that their rights are protected, because it didn't happen this time around. And this is again where I move from the personal to the systematic. So I am a white, cis male, upper middle class, well-educated individual when it comes to disability rights. I'm not a lawyer, but I can read the law. But also, like, as a journalist, I'm extremely well connected across
Sure.
both the state and local and federal governments, right? I can get my state educator on the phone. I can get national leaders in disability rights texting me back, right? I can hire a lawyer. Like, there's a lot of privilege there, and we have totally failed. So if we're failing, I think about, if I succeed and I use all those resources, I think, boy, is that not a just system? We have to make sure everyone has those resources. When I fail, despite all of those resources and privileges, I mean, I think of everyone downstream who's also
Yeah.
failed, right?
Yeah.
Everyone is failing. And there's just a lot of work to be done there. So that's really one of my advocacy missions over the next couple of years, is to try to
Yeah. And,
fix that.
during the whole pandemic, you know, special education has definitely suffered. Um, the kids need kind of that one-on-one, that in the classroom kind of activity, and it's really been difficult for them.
Yeah. And there's just these things, and this again, it's the kind of stuff I try to call attention to in my writing. So the state of Minnesota provides my son with a one-on-one aide. And once we passed the hard lockdown, that aide was able to return to work. But because education is guaranteed under a different law, we are not allowed to use that aid for education. The school district's supposed to pay the aid for education, but the school district said no. So the Department of Human Services says you can have an aid and they can help your son get dressed, go to the bathroom, have a meal, activities of daily living, right? These are terms you probably know, but right. The aid can help my son with these, but the aid cannot help my son add 2 + 2 or whatever it is. That the aid can't do legally. The school district's supposed to do that, but the school district says no. So here's a system, right? A bureaucratic system that creates a hole, and the net result is special education fails. Because when I talk about this, I want people to understand that there are solutions. There are solutions. And that's what we have to work for as advocates. That's what we have to call attention to as journalists, right? That some problems are very hard and there are no solutions, or they're not obvious solutions, but some problems are less hard. It just takes will and sometimes money to do it. And so that is a place where, as a journalist, I hope to really, I hope to really draw attention to that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I hope you really break ground with that, David. I would be really excited to read more what
It's
you
gonna
got
be
going
it's
for
gonna
it.
be it's gonna be a fight. It's gonna be a fight.
But
Yeah.
Because
it's worthwhile.
I think the second the pandemic is over, whatever over means, when we try to fix problems that emerged during the pandemic, the response will be, well, that was a 2020, 2021 problem. It's 2022 now. We don't have to, that's not going to happen again. And I think it's when we locate a gap, we have to work at it, even if we think the crisis is past.
We want to thank you for joining us today. Some great information, great things to think about when it comes to, how COVID has affected education and, the struggles you have seen as a parent for a child with disability. We wish you continued luck in the battle, and because your battle will help kids everywhere.
Thank you.
And
Well,
so,
it's really nice to meet both of you. Thanks for having me on.
yep, thank you. I'm Charlie Brose. For my partner, Tricia Carlberg, this has been Disability Landscape, and we'll see you next time.